Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to Informatics Grand Rounds, our first Q4 presentation. While we're talking about the fourth quarter, just to remind you that you've seen the courses that we're currently presented on the screen. We do have a couple of courses for the summer, in case you can't think of going for some time without some informatics education. We have information sources and search techniques for informatics professionals taught by the Welsh folks. Since literature searching around informatics is a bit different than looking for biomedical knowledge. And the second course is Data-Driven Digital Health Entrepreneurship, taught by Mark Kaminsky, is a relatively new course on the business side of digital health, an area that a lot of our folks are interested in. As so that if you have any questions about those courses, either contact me directly or our staff, and we'll be happy to help you get registered. Very excited to have speaking with us our very own Hopkins faculty member and BIDS member, Scott Levin. Scott Levin is an associate director of emergency medicine in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Johns Hopkins. He serves as the associate director for research within the department, and he's director for systems for the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare, housed at the Whiting School of Engineering on the Homewood campus. His research contributions have focused on development and deployment of data science and systems engineering tools to study and improve healthcare delivery, which is basically the heart of today's presentation. And so you'll get a sense of what he's been up to. These interventions include an emphasis on innovations in health informatics towards supporting data-driven operations and medical decision-making. He has been a PI and actively involved in many efforts through the NSF, the NIH, ARC, National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Engineering, Department of Homeland Security, and DARPA. Very active and very productive research tied to real-life decision-making. The results of his work are found in numerous publications, and you'll get a hint of that as we go towards his presentation. So, Scott, let me have you take it away.
All right, thank you so much for the intro, Harold, and I'm very happy to be here. And just want to reiterate what Harold said, which is, if you have questions, I prefer this to be somewhat interactive. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A, and then Harold will interrupt me, which I welcome, and we can address questions as we go. I'm talking about today, just trying to give the group here a sense of a lot of the practical implications and the practical problems that we address with informatics and deploying them in real world settings and studying them in real world settings. Most all of the work that I do is focused on data science and using data within the electronic health record, and sometimes data we collect outside of the electronic health record, and using that data and infusing it back at the point of care to influence really clinical decision making in practice, and then of course measure that. First, just want to disclose that not much, but some of the work in this presentation is tied to a startup company that has spun out of Hopkins that I'm a co-founder of, and so this is just your basic disclosure. This through a National Science Foundation program, a lot of the research we've done or we've been able to do at Hopkins, NSF provides a mechanism to get that out and to commercialize, which is a whole different kind of a flavor to doing research and implementing, but I just wanted to disclose. So on the agenda, I'm going to talk about, have had a lot of experience deploying these technologies, have had some successes and a lot of failures, and so I've learned like some lessons along the way. And I'm just trying to walk through how, at least an engineer, and my background is biomedical engineering, and I take a complete kind of engineering viewpoint on a lot of the tools we develop and the problems we're trying to solve. But from that engineering viewpoint, how we think about, what problems to solve and how to do that. So first, I'll talk about the decision-making context that is always the beginning of these projects. Then some information about how to create a decision support platform and what are the features of that platform, and really what does it take to both do that internally within a health system, but also to bring that external. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study these tools in the real world, because it's oftentimes it's fairly difficult to run a randomized control trial or even to randomize sites to different interventions. So there's I think a clever approach that helps us study these tools as they evolve in a pretty scientifically rigorous way, but also get you to the end point of having the best product to sustain after that. And I'll show you some examples, but overall the learning objectives are to demonstrate data science to praxis, that pipeline under an effectiveness implementation hybrid design, and then just the steps in developing data-driven software internally and beyond.
So,
Yep.
Scott, Dr. Ray already comes up with a question about, and obviously you're not going to answer it yet, but if there's data that is influencing decision making, clinical decision making, that is not part of the medical record, there is medical legal risk and ethical issues around that. So, presumably, you'll discuss that as you come up to that.
Yeah. Yep.
Good.
So this is our group at Hopkins that works pretty closely out of emergency medicine, our Center for Data Science. And so a lot of this work stems from this group. And we have a lot of other external collaborators, but this group meets pretty regularly, and we're pretty close knit. So just to start, one of the first things I think about when deploying a tool or solving problem is what level of the healthcare system are we trying to directly um, improve or influence. And so I use this model here from Furley and Shortell that depicts a 4-level healthcare system, starting with the patient and then extending to the care team, which they include family members in that care team, then to the organization, and obviously there's an emergency department. The emergency department's within the hospital. And then there's the environment that the healthcare organization is functioning in. And so things that are happening in the environment will propagate back to the organization, to the care team, to the patient. So no matter what level of the system we're focused on for decision support, there's always going to be dependencies. Um, but I'll primarily today going to be talking about clinical decision making that is for an individual provider or a provider care team taking care of a patient, but have also done quite a bit of work at more of a macro level to support decisions for hospital operations, and also work that is now way more relevant than when I was doing it, but work around supporting decision making primarily for the federal government and NIH and how they invest in vaccine technologies years ago. But I'll focus here as most relevant to this group, and I think a lot of the students in the program. There's the system, and then there's, particularly for the clinical decision making group, there's users. And these users are people, and all these people, primarily clinicians, there's a ton of variability in the way that they behave because they're human beings, just like the rest of us. So I'm typically, when deploying tools, can identify people on these ends very quickly. These late adopters and these innovative type leaders. The people in the middle, I worry about less because they usually fall in line. If something is proven, they'll sort of fall, and they're good. They're actually reducing variability. But these folks are the ones, when we go into a system, I'll be able to see early. And it turns out that a lot of these times, these late adopters, the people that are resistant to change, and this is, you're deploying a decision support tool, so there is some change that exists. Um, these these people that are usually resistant, I find, um, tend to be the biggest champions of these technologies once they see value in them. So I'm always happy to actually work and identify these people and engage with them at a more frequently, and as opposed to ignore them, which is what some I think developers do. Um, but it's important to know, whenever whenever you're deploying these tools, people will fall on the spectrum. There's already tons of built-in variability in how physicians or clinicians in general practice. And so oftentimes a tool can be very useful for one person and they think it's the best thing, and then you talk to somebody else and they think it's horrible. And when you're an engineer and a technology developer, that gets can get confusing. So it's just an important um, aspect, that when we're doing all this data science work, we're really actually studying people and their behavior. um, so when we're generally developing a platform, this is what I feel has been part of, in some form, all of the different projects I've done, whether it's been at Hopkins or through our commercial group. It's there's a cloud platform that ingests data, and that is, Microsoft Azure, that can be Amazon AWS, but it's a platform, and it's not as if you go to Microsoft and you buy a cloud. It's not, that's not really how it works. What Microsoft or Amazon or the Google provide you is a toolkit. And those toolkits allow you to build and turn on security features, turn them off. Microsoft and these companies, they try to automate everything and make it easy, but it's not ever as easy it's never as easy as they portray. um, but these cloud platforms, there's all different aspects, and usually it's not one person that can build this. There's different parts of the technology stack that people have expertise, whether it's architecture, data flow, database, security, integration. Um, and all of them are actually building this cloud and enabling it. And what you hope is, as you develop a tool, the the infrastructure that you're building scales. And that's to some extent what's happened, both internal to Hopkins and external, in that a lot of the uh, when we're doing research and building technologies that they're then deployed, a lot of that infrastructure then can get reused for other projects. And it's kind of it's a cycle where, once you're able to prove you can deploy a technology, have a change, you then are in a position to do research on clinical decision support that other people can't do, or is more rare. So there's a kind of a cycle of building the technology, studying it, and then getting that learning back into the technology, and kind of snowballing it.
So
But yep,
Scott, a couple of questions. One is
sure.
about specific, especially about the research side, and at some point, if you could talk about how you get decision support research through an IRB, and when you don't need IRB approval. That one that was and related to that is the patient privacy. And then another question came up is whether you can talk about the relative cost in developing decision support outside the institution in the cloud like this versus developing it internally and maintaining it internally.
Yep. Yeah, so these are a good time to address those questions. So from a IRB perspective, I mean, we're under the same internal to Hopkins. I mean, in any medical facility, we're under the same rules of what's quality improvement versus what's research. And it's oftentimes the way that I look at these things is it's how these projects get initiated. So I am a researcher at Johns Hopkins. If I have an idea, or I'm a physician and I'm primarily a researcher, or my idea is to do research and to publish, and there's a grander plan behind the work, and we think it has there's generalizable knowledge that you then fall into that research bucket, and that's how the project got started. And so right away, you need to submit an IRB, and so you're submitting an IRB, and it depends on where you are. If the clinical decision support already exists, you would submit an IRB to prospectively evaluate it. If you're developing the decision support, you step through collecting the data, building the tool, and I'll usually break things down into two IRBs, one retrospective and one prospective, because when I found that I put them together, it confuses things for people that are reading it, cold. And so it's really the impetus and the rationale for the project. Now, there are projects that start as QI. So if, for example, the head of a sepsis committee comes and says, I really need help, my physician's doing X, Y, and Z, can you help us do this using informatics? And their role is really in charge of quality, or quality of some form. I feel like that goes into the quality bucket, and we're just addressing a ask that somebody in quality leadership is trying to solve. A lot of times, so we can pursue that under a quality improvement, quality assurance framework. But if at any point in time we want to do anything research related to that work, we then go and submit, and we submit an IRB, saying this was a quality improvement project, and now we wish to publish or evaluate it, and you go through the same IRB protocol. The safest thing to do, if you're unsure, is to go to the IRB directly, and ask, describe your project as quality improvement if you believe it's that, and ask for it to be acknowledged as quality improvement. And then the IRB can really guide you into saying this is QI, or this is research. But a lot of times things will traverse from QI to research. And I found just over disclosing everything and making the IRB aware at every step in the way. I mean, Stuart Ray's on this call. A lot of folks are happy to just answer questions, and I just listen to them generally. And that's, I think, the best approach. And then to the other question about the costs. So internally, there has been steps taken to advance some work on the cloud. I've actually used some of the Microsoft Cloud internally, but it's hard because it's not set up. All the stuff that has to be done is not like we would need to set it up, or Hopkins, and it's more likely the actual team that's building the tool would need to set up the cloud in a way that is useful for them. External, I mean, I'd say it costs, I mean, probably like $200,000 to $500,000. I mean, I just ballparking, to get a cloud stood up in the way that is going to pass muster and can like interoperate with a health system, because there's tons of security checks and penetration tests, a lot of stuff that I don't frankly know about. But you have to get, you have to hire somebody that knows the security, and a lot of these folks, these engineers that are working outside of Hopkins, that know how to build cloud infrastructure and know, database, I mean, they're in demand. So the costs of that are high, and a lot of times you need full-time people to do this work. It's not, it's fairly difficult to have some part-time people developing this. So that's what I'd say to run it. Like it would be maybe around $500,000 to get started. And this is what, the NSF for us and our company, I mean, it provided us the capital to do that. Um, but so, yeah,
And Dr. Ray is pointing out that if, and this is a little hard to do, if the researcher anticipates spinning out a company later on, it's the earlier you can let, and Stuart, maybe you want to say more about this, but the the earlier you can let people know that you're thinking about that, the better it will be downstream. Uh, I can imagine that you don't know yet, taking into account what you said about failing, you you don't know yet at what point you might want to do that spinning out. And in related to Dr. Stewart's, the other Stewart's point about the cloud versus not, I mean, there are a lot of companies whose business model is, in fact, to do what you just said, which is to stand up that cloud infrastructure and then through fire or whatever, provide the decision support. But I don't know at what point you know that you're going to be able to pull that off.
yeah, and I think a lot of this is around there's JHTV and there's disclosures of IP, and I think a lot of that's kind of the first step. So if you think something is valuable, whether you're going to start a company or not, or how it's going to get out into the world, if you think you have something that's valuable and potentially commercializable, going to JHTV and disclosing it early is the best path. And then, JHTV can guide where to go from there. But JHTV and the IRB presumably should be communicating. So when you then submit an IRB, um, there's JHTV knows what IRBs link to what technologies that think have value. Um, and it won't be too burdensome, really, to move forward in that way um, early, honestly.
I didn't realize we would have we were advertising our entrepreneurship class,
This always happens
but
to me.
thank you very much. Okay, keep on going.
Yep. Um, so more for the technology, we have this cloud platform. If there's a need for a mobile view, we've done some tools that have that. Always with these technologies, there's a connection to the EHR via like a real-time connection. And this is like web. There's really three flavors of that: web services that are usually specific to the EHR, HL7, which is standard, and then FHIR. And these are just really mechanisms or standards of communicating. Um, the Epic has a Epic App Orchard program, which when if there's a technology that there's interest in determining how it can work across all Epic clients, their Epic App Orchard can help you design this, and we'll even provide support to it over time. And Cerner similarly has the code program, and the Cerner and Epic are like completely different in their approaches of how they want to manage this, and so I'll just kind of leave it at that. But this is this integration component. It's a one or two people need expertise in this area. And then there's always a connection to the EHR, to the repository. So like Clarity in Epic. And we need that because what we want to do is we're often looking at what happened to the patients, what were their outcomes, was our decision support guiding clinicians in a good way, or when was it right, when was it wrong, and we want to evaluate that. So we'll always have a connection to the EHR, and this is batching data, once a week or once a month. And these two data streams, I've found over time this feedback view being super, super important, especially in emergency medicine. So really what that means is you introduce an intervention into a healthcare system that's physicians are interacting with. It's important right off the bat to show them what are they doing, what's happening, what is the value. For emergency department physicians, they're operating in an open loop system, which is they're taking care of patients. It's an episodic care environment. They don't have a relationship with the patient for the most part before the patient comes to them. The patients that are really sick go on to the hospital, some, or go home, and they're really not. There's not really not much information fed back to emergency providers, and I think even any providers that are working in the hospital that aren't, doing outpatient type longitudinal visits. They're we don't know what happened, and so providing this feedback is super valuable just in general, because right now what ED physicians are doing is they'll occasionally think about a patient, they'll look them up in Epic, and that's the extent of it. They don't know what they're missing. They don't know, if adverse events happen downstream. And so if we can provide this feedback loop first and then drop a tool into their environment and show how this tool is related to outcomes and is potentially helping, which we know from the data, this gets buy-in, particularly for those late adopters, because the late adopters, I feel, start to realize, wow, I've been doing this practice for 30 years in the ED, but all this time I never knew that certain aspects of it could be improved. And I think it's a hard thing for folks to realize. It's a hard thing for just me personally to realize like that. Okay, there's some practice I've been doing for a long time could be flawed, and it's just because there was no visibility. And I think unfortunately the EHRs, while they're very useful for managing the patient in the moment and looking up old prior history and organizing everything, they don't provide a very, very easy way to get feedback on clinical outcomes. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Scott,
Yeah.
I missed a question that Steve Mandel asked before. You were saying about how expensive it is to run a cloud operation. Even with the Azure infrastructure we now have, let's say for PMAP and such, we don't. Are you saying we don't have that infrastructure that could support a cloud-based operation?
We don't we have, I think, purchased. We have a cloud, or I got onto our cloud, provision a cloud for one of our projects. And the reality is so we have the Microsoft cloud, but as I was saying before, there's a lot of work that needs to get done to configure a cloud into into what's needed to be a software. Now, I do think that doing this internally should be easier because you're sort of you're within the Hopkins firewall, so you don't have to worry about as much. But I still think it's there's I think Hopkins could definitely do it. I don't think they've done it fully yet, but it's something that would require resources. And I think that the challenge that Hopkins has is we've configured the platform for the particular way that our decision support tools function. And we have a pretty well prescribed way in which that happens, whether it be something for the ED or an outpatient facility. But I think what's difficult about doing this internally at Hopkins to some extent is the challenge is to design for anybody that could want to create cloud-based decision support, and I'm not sure that that's tractable. So there is these precision medicine centers of excellence, and they are more focused. And I think that Hopkins is smart in driving those and building infrastructure around those, because I think it is very difficult to do this universally. So I hopefully that answers your question. I think it's possible, but to my knowledge, it does not doing a cloud-based decision support tool at Hopkins isn't, um, I don't think I've seen it yet.
So if anybody knows otherwise, if you could write
Yeah.
Q&A. And Dr. Florea asks a question about when you talk about the cloud and EHR connection, is that live or a mirror? And I think it's a live connection, isn't it?
Yeah. So this connection, like this is a EHR, HL7 Fire Web Services is like the information is entered and we get it communicated to us. Um, and and so
Oh,
this is live. This is the mirror, the EHR
oh,
repository.
when you say us, do please clarify who the we
So
is?
us being the owner of the decision support tool. So anybody owning a decision support tool, so whether it's internal at Hopkins or external, this is a real time connection. Um, and and you know I the piece of this connection that's important actually is to understand the trigger, um, and when it connects. Since I can tell there's interest in just some of the technical, I'll continue to talk about some of this. But the how a decision support tool actuates is one of the first things you want to think about. So I always think about, like, there's two different ways. One is surveillance and the other one is event based. And I just made up this language. It's not anything I pulled from a textbook, but surveillance, as you can imagine, is something where as data comes in, as new data appears, we're like sepsis surveillance. Those are generally surveillance tools. As new data arises, um, whatever the risk score or whatever is being output is updated kind of passively. And if it exceeds a certain threshold, there could be an alert. But overall, this connection is like a flowing surveillance based connection. The work that I typically do is more event based, because I found that producing a risk score at just in the EHR is definitely, there's a time and place for it, but I'm not sure what action it's driving at times and I can't measure it as well. So my engineering mindset like takes me away from wanting to do that. I will want to try to influence a particular decision, which some of the examples I'll show later, um, will show you. But so a patient is being triaged, or a patient is being dispositioned, or a patient is receiving an antibiotic. I want to influence that clear decision, which is to give the antibiotic or not, what antibiotic. So I want to I want the event to in the antibiotic example, if I want to inform antibiotic decision making, when somebody is going to prescribe an antibiotic, that is the event that triggers the decision support, runs the data, goes to the cloud, does the algorithm, and produces the output back. So I'll always want decision support that can produce within seconds, because I won't know that a provider is about to make a decision typically until seconds before they do it. So that's an event-based trigger. I can then measure, well, did my decision support say, steer clear of vancomycin, and did the provider do it? I can then very clearly measure whether they followed the recommendation or not. And I like that. I then have a clear measure of what's the behavior. Am I changing behavior? And so I'm always looking for. I steer away from. I failed enough times at developing decision support where there wasn't a clear action that I could measure and inform. Um, and it's here. There's some other. This is from Kawamoto, but I've also found, like, you know, there's features that they've done research on about what features make a tool successful or not. And this is sort of when I veer away from these things, when our team veers away from some of these, it doesn't work. So there is a lot of literature out there that's quite useful in providing some guardrails. And a lot of folks will often ask, like, well, how do you decide what problems to address? And I'll, typically there's a clinical problem. There's variability in care. So some providers are doing it different than the other. And then if I have a decision support tool that can address it, does it meet these features? So
Just
yeah.
out of curiosity, do you ever do a decision model before you dive in?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because I'll like another one is I've done stuff where I'm trying to inform teams of clinicians as opposed to an individual clinician decision, and that's so much harder. So like when the decision making process is more complicated or involves multiple people, that comes to light in a decision model. So I mean it. Yeah, I mean I spend a lot of time up front, like
Like,
understanding the problem and how decisions are made.
I mean, physically creating decision trees or Markov models or stuff like that?
Yeah, we'll map it out. So like we'll do. I don't. We'll do like what are they called? I mean, I'll generally do,
A workflow diagram?
yeah, like workflow process map, because it's like what's the decisions and what are the actions that occur from those decisions. Um, well, I use all of those things that, because again, like engineering, it's great for engineers to visualize like
Hmm.
flow diagrams. I mean, that's the best way for a physician really to describe to an engineer what is happening in their in the system they're working in. Um, the other thing that I think is super important is this in all the technologies we build to try to find the sweet spot between something that's scalable and something that's can adapt. Um, and there is a sweet spot because there's so much variability in in healthcare at the individual level, at the organizational level, that it's I think naive to think that you can scale something to eliminate all that variability. I also think that there's some good variability. I mean, clinician behavior isn't completely irrational. It's rational, and there's workarounds, and they're doing things to for specific reasons to help patients. And if you try to eliminate that, we're probably in a worse off healthcare system. So it's this balance of trying to take out what I would call like untoward variability, the variability that isn't productive or isn't good for the patient, which in many cases is unknown to providers until we do things like this. But this is a really important component, because I think from a commercial perspective, this is very scary to um, to investors. For example, they don't, everybody wants something that scales perfectly. You can go to 1,000 hospitals with the same product, not change it, and I just don't think that that's the reality.
There's also the medical legal issue, though, about if you have a product that has to be locally adapted. Now, who's got the responsibility for those adaptations, and do they want to take that on? And that's
Right, right, and I'll generally like where this stuff meets is if you have a scalable process, um, and you have a good quality control and quality management system, and the FDA actually um, provides a lot of guidance around this. And the FDA is in this decision support world doesn't necessarily care. Like they don't necessarily say, well, your model has to be this accurate or it has to be this good for us to give you approval. What the FDA and really just, I think as when you're responsible for one of these, you want to have it's a quality management system. It's a way to see, okay, when I'm pulling data at one site, is it the same that I'm pulling at the other site? Is the code, the way all the code propagates and the way I'm normalizing the differences between different facilities, is it all going into a scalable pipeline? And do I have checks along the way to address, to see if there's something wrong? And so a lot of work here, and again, this is all this is all part of the decision support, goes in creating these pipelines and these monitoring mechanisms to ensure that you have a high quality system. So, like one of the things that people will often ask is, well, if you have something running at 10 sites and there's a problem, are you going to know it? When are you going to know it? And the answer should be, well, I know it immediately. And so there's a lot of infrastructure to be built to monitor is did a connection change here?
Right.
And it's all the things that Epic, the change management system for Epic does well. It's all those things you become, or whether you're working internally or externally, kind of responsible for that change management and that quality control, and that's a big piece of
So
this work.
I
Yeah,
worry that I'm taking a little bit off track, and I know folks want to see examples. So, uh,
yeah. One thing I'll just say is, uh, when we study this, I'm always using this model. So when we deploy a tool, it's this effectiveness implementation hybrid design. So never really sure exactly. There's usually some development in how we should communicate information to physicians. So I'll start with the type 3 model, and testing to some extent the implementation strategy and gather information on outcomes, but not look to evaluate it. Then it shifts to dual testing, and eventually we're in steady state where the implementation is fixed. How we're going to do this is fixed. And then I'm gathering outcomes. And this is where the evaluation impact analysis happens. And so NIH and ARC and NSF, framing and decision support study in this way has worked to get, to kind of illustrate the process of developing a tool and studying it in one fell swoop. For those that are more like software developers, it's just during this implementation phase to be able to execute this agile development cycle during that more implementation phase of the work. And so this is just like an example of, when we're doing a study, pre-intervention control, we're moving to pilot testing at one site, and then going live at that site, gathering data, and then post intervention. So it's fixed, and then we'll go to the next site, and we'll actually be able to compare this time period while it was live at this site to this time period that wasn't live at another site. And so you get kind of a nice design in order that allows you to compare pre and post and compare across sites over the same time period, which
and
will address a lot of concerns people have with study designs that aren't randomized.
this visualization is exactly why it's called a stepped wedge design.
Right. That's the step. Yep.
Keep going.
Yep. So the few examples is one where, in order of maturity from we just started to it's out into the world. You know, we have a technology focused on predicting acute kidney injury in the ED. We've built a model to do that and prove that retrospectively, there's something there. Like we can predict acute kidney injury fairly well within the first hour of when a patient arrives to the ED. And we have a lot of the data science work, develop that model, prep it, pull the cohort of all ED patients, prep the data. Dealing with high dimensional data is important. Like chief complaints, there's 1,000 different chief complaints that can be entered. There's thousands of different active problems that can be. These information are very, very useful, and so, but they're highly dimensional. So learning how to determine how to reduce that dimensionality in healthcare data is a really important component of like what the engineers will call feature engineering. I'll also say here that the data prep, you look at like this, what the steps are and actually getting to the point where you're fitting a model. This data prep takes 90% of the time, and the rest of this stuff can be done in a day. So it's just understanding the data in detail, checking the outcomes, all what I call like normalization is the bulk of the work. In this particular acute kidney injury, it's very interesting to me clinical problem because there are well-known interventions, or I should say just like withholding of certain interventions that are known to improve outcomes for patients either with acute kidney injury or at risk of acute kidney injury. And then they're really not debated. And so when you look in the ED and you even look in the hospital, a lot of these things aren't happening. And so we're trying to figure out, well, why is that? Is it because people aren't aware? That's probably part of it. They may not be aware that somebody's at risk of AKI, but there's also some other things, and they call it like the knowledge to action pipeline. Like, ED providers may not believe that acute kidney injury is part of their scope of practice. It's something that can happen later on, or they might, think that the benefits of these interventions are worth the risk. And so it's not just necessarily that somebody isn't aware of something in clinical decision support. It's also and this gets to what Harold was saying with the decision making model. It's also is there other reasons that even if they're aware this patient's at risk and there's evidence to take action, that they're not doing that? And oftentimes there is good reasons. So that's just important. But this is the example I gave about we would eventually want to um, intervene on a medication. So this decision support, we wouldn't be just saying, hey, this patient's high risk of acute kidney injury. I don't, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to go to the different places in the EHR where these events occur. And this is an example, the really high, the biggest bang for the buck one is just sets of nephrotoxic medications. And this is what decision support that I think would be more effective and that we plan to build will do. At that point, when they're going to order that medication, we would provide this information passively to them. It wouldn't be a hard stop. It wouldn't be something they have to click off. It really would just be within their workflow, and it would inform them. And then if we can do even better and give them an alternative, like you were going to prescribe medication X, but medication Y may be better for this patient. So provide them an easy alternative. That's where behavior changes. Like you've sort of made it easy for the physician, particularly in the ED that has no time, is managing tons of patients, to just get to understand what's going on very quickly with the patient in a palatable way, and issue a recommendation that then they can choose to follow or not. But I do find that when you do it this way, they tend to follow it. The other one is other example is our COVID decision support tool, which has been running now for a few months, where we're taking information that accumulates over the course of the patient's ED, the care in the emergency department, and we're only looking at patients that are PUIs in this case. So patients are either confirmed positive for COVID or are have an isolation, or so it's unknown, and they're still under investigation. We take this information, vitals, trends, oxygen labs. We're predicting a critical outcome and an inpatient care need outcome, and providing a risk level 1 through 10. And then this risk level translates to the level of care that could be recommended for that patient. And you see, we did this very early, a few months ago when the COVID was surging, and there was use of this field hospital, and this was built to help determine who should go to that field hospital. So we've had it running for several months, and I've got a bunch of data on it, but I'll just sort of show you when you run the model silently. This is the AUC and the dotted line. And then when we made it visible and turned it on, the AUC got better. And that's because people started following it. So this gets into this, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you turn on decision support to predict something, and then clinicians will behave or can behave in line with what's being recommended. And so this is where when people talk about, well, if there's problems in the healthcare system or bias in outcomes and such, we've got to be careful to not perpetuate them. And I'm not saying we're doing that here, but this is why they say that, because a lot of times when the decision support is of a certain quality level, providers will start following it. And this decision support is very simple. In the disposition navigator section of Epic, we provide a risk level, and you can link out to this, which describes more about what that means. And then our last one is our triage tool, which we have running at um, multiple hospitals outside of Hopkins. And this is to address this problem with the emergency severity index. When a patient first comes into the ED, they're triage level 1 through 5. Based on what level they're given, they go to a different part of the ED, and our different processes occur for them. And so you have this system that's supposed to differentiate patients, but everybody goes, 2/3 of the patients are in level 3, which is really just saying we're uncertain whether this person is sick or not. So we developed this tool to try to separate high and from low risk level 3s using data. And we similarly, right in the triage navigator section, are recommending a triage level. We're doing some interpretable AI where we actually say, oh, I don't have it on the screenshot. We're actually saying why it is we're recommending this triage level, and then the nurse manually assigns, like they always would, the triage. And so we see, when we do that, the triage across all the sites changes pretty drastically, and we're able to identify patients that need critical care at a higher rate, and speed time to ICU transfer, emergency surgery, just speed time to treatment for these high risk patients. And we're constantly, evaluating what's the agreement with Triage Go. And when you first implement it, it's 50%, and then when it's in steady state, it's 85%. And when we look at we'll look at individual clinicians and how much they agree. And if somebody is agreeing 100%, we know that they're probably not using their clinical judgment. And when somebody's agreeing 50%, we know that they're probably not looking at it. And so it's a way to actually hone in on the people that I showed you in that adoption model that are either using it or not, and actually intervening with them to show them, how we may want to change their behavior or not. So I know this is a lot, and I sped through the examples very quickly. But overall, these are the major lessons that over time with all these technologies you've learned. It's one, and Harold is getting at it. It's like study the problem way more than you think you need to. And for those of us that are more like technologists or engineers, our problem is we always have solutions looking for problems. And that's not really the right way to do it. So this problem focus is super important. The next is, like, I've always wanted to focus on something measurable processes and outcomes. So it's really cool. It's cool to talk about a technology that can help, but if the success of that technology isn't clear, meaning it can't be measured, it's really hard to get traction. So the other is to be super user focused and understand the value proposition. So, again, from the technologist standpoint, we tend to weigh like the technology more than the people. And I've learned over time that studying people is actually more important than necessarily studying the data and the technology. And I went over this one. And then I think the other thing is when we're working, I think this is both internal and external. It's trying to recognize that you're always going to need champions, whether you're internal or external, especially if you're a technologist. You need clinical champions to help shepherd through these projects. And it's very important to try to recognize, all right, well, who's a good clinical champion? Are they excited about it? Are they willing to put in work? But also, can they make a decision? Can they change something in the healthcare? Like, do they have authority, or do they have a way to influence that authority? Because I do see a lot of engineers get trapped into working with clinicians, and the clinicians get very excited about what they're doing, but the clinician then may not be able to drive what it takes to actually implement something in the in a clinical environment. So it's just recognizing who does that, and who may not be able to. And then it's just the problems are generalizable, and I've always underestimated the resources needed to make these projects successful, and I probably still do that because I just want to get started often. But in the end, to make these things very successful, or to make them successful, you need a lot of support, the feedback loop, implementation, any holes and these tools can fail. So I'll stop there. I know I'm at the end of time. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, no, it's terrific, and it's always frustrating that you can't get a good applause on a web. And this interface doesn't even let us do the little applaud thing. Um, but we have two. Dr. Ray was pointing out the importance of recognizing solutions, looking for problems, and that is certainly a occupational hazard of anybody in informatics. For Dr. Floria, uh, Dr. Najee before asked about how do you evaluate, and I think you brought up some very nice points. Dr. Floria is asking about what do you do on the patient side, and related to that, we didn't get to address when you study decision support. At what point do you need patient consent? So those are two sides: patient consent and patient outcomes. Patient.
Yeah, I mean the decision support that we largely build is for clinicians. So the user is the clinician, and so I've done some work where there's more patient centered shared decision making, and then the patient becomes like you have to engage a group of patients to and put that into the project. But for the most part, the outcomes that I'm looking at are very clear and measurable in the EHR. That's like sort of some of the criteria to do the project for me. And they're often clinical conditions or states, and so those are the patient outcomes. In terms of like the patient consent, I mean, we're for the most part, it's not really feasible. So this is all the IRB decides, um, whether it's appropriate to have a waiver of consent in this project or not. I think the main thing is it's very important when you implement these things to train the people that are at least the early users of make it completely transparent what's going on behind these algorithms and where they fail and where they can fail is actually the most important thing. And so that's often what what we'll do, but that's the user. And but we're doing most all these studies under of a waiver of consent. And for the most part, we're making a recommendation in the EHR surrounding a decision that was already going to be made in routine care for that patient, and providing more information at that decision point. So that's how we frame it. And that's typically not required, or hasn't to this point required, patient consent.
Well, terrific. That'll be our closing comment, and I know the people taking the decision support course will have found this an invaluable presentation, and everybody on the line who has been involved in decision support one way or the other. It's a real pleasure to hear both the progress that you've made, the learning, both the fortunate and the unfortunate learning that you've gone through, and being able to communicate it so clearly. So thank you so much.